Welcome to this fourth and final lecture in the series on universal wisdom in the Egyptian African tradition. First, a brief recap of the previous lectures, in which we discussed the sources from which the ancient Egyptians derived their profound knowledge and wisdom, namely from Atlantis and South India. The high culture that Egypt once experienced, traces of which we can still find today in the form of, among other things, the Great Pyramid, the remains of temples, etc., and the knowledge about the afterlife and initiation is found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Last week, we also delved into the Hermetic tradition as the underlying religion philosophy of ancient Egyptian culture. The conclusions were, due to its great antiquity, several tens of thousands of years, this tradition has not come down to us completely intact, but it is nevertheless a clear echo of universal wisdom or Theosophia. In today's lecture, we will show the connection between contemporary African philosophy of Ubuntu and the universal wisdom or Theosophia, in which the Hermetic tradition of ancient Egypt has played a significant role. Because of the predominantly universal nature of Ubuntu philosophy, it has great potential for healing polarized communities, as it emphasizes the oneness and the interconnectedness of all life. We will explain the source and characteristics of the philosophy and how it is still relevant and practically applied today. Examples will show that this philosophy offers many possibilities for restoring harmony in society, even when there are or have been serious disruptions to that harmony. The topics of the lecture are as follows. Block 1 is about the ancient wisdom of Africa. Block 2 is about Ubuntu as an echo of this ancient wisdom of Africa. And 3 is about living by Ubuntu, and we will give a number of practical examples. So first, the ancient wisdom of Africa. The first relevant question for today's topic is, does Africa even have a wisdom tradition? The actual history of the African continent is largely shrouded in mystery. Fossils indicate that humans lived on the African continent as early as 3 million years ago, but very little is known about this. Only about the northern part, particularly Egypt, do we know a little more. Almost nothing is known about sub-Saharan Africa, because as far as we know, no peoples who knew writing lived there long ago. Africa has a wide variety of people, from tall, gigantic, dark-skinned people to very short, light-skinned people. There have also been continuous migrations. For example, in 500 AD, the Bantus migrated south from Sudan and thus spread across much of Africa. Throughout its history, there have been several highly organized kingdoms, such as Ethiopia in the 4th century AD, with a very mixed population, Ghana and Dahomey, present-day Benin, which flourished in the 11th century, and in the 14th century, the Kingdom of Mali. To the question, does the African continent have a wisdom tradition? The answer is yes, it does. And we will shortly see what has been an important source of this. African culture was not as primitive as some people may think. But due to the often aggressive influences from Northern Africa, from Christian and Islamic cultures, it was not given the opportunity to develop further for many centuries. Now, from Theosophy, we know that every people can open themselves to the inspiration of the lodge of wisdom and compassion. This is also the case on the African continent, which is also evident when we study all the traces of esoteric knowledge found in the thousands of stories of African peoples. For example, in the stories of the Dogon people in Mali, about the origins of the cosmos, the cosmogenesis, and of the origins of humanity, the anthropogenesis. Take, for example, the world egg of the Dogon. It proposes that movement first arose in the so-called world egg, which existed before the manifested cosmos, just as we also know the world egg from Egyptian culture and the egg of Brahma from Indian philosophy. In the world egg of the Dogon, there are initially no individual beings. Then, at a certain point, the first being, Amma, emerges. This Amma is seen as the architect who, like a spider, allows a web to emanate from herself, thus creating the cosmos. Amma then has sons, called Nomo, divine beings from whom, after much development, humans emerge. Humans are reflections of these divine beings, but during this very long process of creation, all sorts of things go wrong, so that ultimately Earth is not a paradise, but a harsh learning experience. The goal of this learning experience is to realize more fully, through self-directed development, that man is indeed, at its core, a divine being. It is striking that this story is very similar to the teachings of Theosophia, and many African peoples have stories similar to those of the Dogon. The next question is, what was an important source of this ancient wisdom in Africa? According to interpretations of the theosophist Patrick Bowen, a brotherhood called Bona Bakulu Abbas Ekemu was founded during the reign of Pharaoh Cheops of the 4th dynasty, some 4,600 years back. This name of this brotherhood can be translated into English as the Brotherhood of the Exalted Ones of Egypt. The founder was a priest of Isis. The language used by the Brotherhood was an ancient Bantu language, which became the basis of the widespread group of Bantu languages on the African continent. The purpose of the Brotherhood was to spread wisdom among all races and tribes of Africa, and for its members to study and practice what was called the science of mind power, the only true science there is. That is, to use one's mind for self-directed development. More information on ancient wisdom in Africa, such as regarding the origin of the cosmos, the origin of humanity and evolution, has become known through the same Patrick Bowen. He was an Irishman who worked in southern Africa for about 20 years at the beginning of the last century. At a young age, he met a wise African called Melo Moya, a member of the aforementioned brotherhood, which originated in ancient Egypt. This brotherhood had different degrees, and members of the higher degrees were called those who know. At its head was the Ancient One. After many years of study, Bowen received permission to publish certain fragments of an archaic work written in the ancient, now defunct, Bantu language called Isinzu. These fragments were published as Sayings of the Ancient One. In this work, it becomes very clear how much the basic ideas of Theosophy resonate within it. I will now first discuss some key concepts of ancient African wisdom that demonstrate its universality through its strong alignment with the three fundamental principles of Theosophy. For reasons of comparison, I have summarized these fundamental theosophical principles, as already discussed in the first lecture of this series, once again in the left column, and in the right column you will see the characteristics of the ancient wisdom of Africa. The first concept in this African philosophy is Aitonga, which for the average person is explained in simple terms as the spirit of the tribe, but it has the more profound meaning of the spirit that permeates all life, universal spirit, and from which everything originates. Man is a spark of Aitonga. His deepest essence is Aitonga, and therefore, spiritually speaking, all people are brothers, sprung from the same universal unity, that is, connectedness of all beings. This definition is essentially the same as the first fundamental idea of Theosophia, the boundlessness of life and the consequences of that fundamental idea. The second concept is that all beings have boundless potentials that unfold through gradual evolution. Therefore, all beings are equal, even though they are unequal in their stage of development, and that is why there is a spiritual hierarchy. This also gives rise to the idea that the wisest member of a tribe, the chief, is the one who should inspire others. Here also we see agreement with the basic ideas of Theosophy. The third concept is the cyclical unfolding of all beings within the totality of life, that is, through cooperation with other beings. We are therefore talking about reincarnation, but also about the composite nature of every being, consisting of the imperishable core, in African called Aitonga, a learning path, Idolotzi, which in Theosophy is the soul, which cyclically comes to earth to gain experience, and the vehicle for this, the body, Umzimba, called in African philosophy. This cyclical process of reincarnation continues until, after this long learning process, the human being realizes that they are Aitonga in the depths of their being, connected in unity with all other beings. So here again, agreement with the basic theosophical ideas. Thus, we see very clearly this ancient wisdom of Africa is essentially identical to what Theosophia teaches us, especially when we consider that within this brotherhood, the sevenfold composition of man was also taught. Due to time constraints, we will leave this explanation aside today. However, I would like to dwell briefly on some of the ancient one's instructions on how to follow the path to becoming a truly spiritual human being. Now follow some examples of directions for the path of growth to true humanity. The first example. The ancient one said, "The path of light is steep and narrow. He who would tread it must be a man. All may attain unto manhood, O son, if they will but to leave the playground of childhood and enter the path of growth. The path of growth is entered by 3 steps. Hear what I say concerning them and tread them as I direct. 1. Labor always like one that seeks a royal reward for a task well done, but find your reward in work continued and never in work completed. Rejoice if your lot be happy, but if it be miserable, rejoice also. Joy and sadness are your twin slaves, joined from birth, and they must serve you together or serve you not at all. Love life, for he is the great teacher, but love death also, for he is the other self of life, when alone can teach you nothing. There is also an encouraging comment from the Ancient One. Despise not your imperfections, and grieve not for your failings, but understand their nature, and make them steps upon which to mount towards higher states, and then follow more directions on how to follow the path of growth. The Ancient One summarized them as follows. When you stand not apart from anything, but behold all things within yourself, you will know neither good nor evil, neither joy nor grief, neither gain nor loss, nor anything but perfection. Then you will know the way to manhood, and will know that you and the path are one. The Ancient One concludes his teaching as follows. He who walks the path of light is marked by compassion, for he understands the needs of the weary animal, the sorrows of the child, and the mind of the stranger. He is marked by harmony of the soul, for his eye perceives nature, his heart comprehends nature, and his courage enables him to dwell with nature. He is marked by skill in action, for he loves his work, he knows his work, and he works with will for no reward. He is marked by universal vision, for he loves all things, he is just to all beings, and he serves the law with gladness. O my son, when the marks of true manhood are engraved in the substance of your being, you will ask no more for knowledge, nor will you crave to possess it, because you will be knowledge itself. Follow thou after peace. Then we now go to the second topic of today, Ubuntu, echo of the ancient wisdom of Africa. Now let's look at the Ubuntu philosophy of the time we live in. This Ubuntu philosophy, in turn, is an echo of the ancient African wisdom. The first question is, of course, what is Ubuntu philosophy? Many translations of Ubuntu are possible. Oneness, humanity towards others, I am because we are, becoming human through others. A much used definition of Ubuntu is the belief in a universally shared covenant that connects all of humanity. Ubuntu is particularly prevalent in African countries where Bantu languages are spoken. The word Bantu currently means person or human being. However, because the word Bantu has become significantly contaminated in the past due to the use of the name by the apartheid regime in South Africa for certain groups of people, its original meaning has faded. This shows the slide that you see now shows the spread of Ubuntu and the Bantu languages like Swahili, Kikuyu, Xhosa, and many other languages in Africa, especially south of the Sahara. Ubuntu has been around for centuries and gained considerable prominence in the latter half of the 20th century, not least due to development in South Africa, with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu as key figures. Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid activist and later president, said of Ubuntu the following: Ubuntu philosophy is a philosophy of life. Spiritual life force connects the man with his society and nature. The reality is a dynamics of interacting forces. The quest for restoration of harmony and peace in a fragmented world is a crucial purpose. Ubuntu is conciliatory. He gives an example of how in the past, if you traveled through the country and arrived in a village, you didn't have to ask for food and drink. You simply received it automatically from the people you encountered. It's always about solidarity and selflessness. Mandela explains that Ubuntu encompasses much more. This sense of community also places demands on you. You must always work for the well-being and development of the community. Helping in this way makes an important contribution to society. Then Desmond Tutu. He was Archbishop and a human rights activist who defined Ubuntu in this way. Someone with Ubuntu is open to and is accessible to others, dedicates itself to others, does not feel threatened by the talents of others, because he or she has enough confidence from knowing that he or she is part of a larger whole and is cringing when others are humiliated or when others are tortured or suppressed. Tutu chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which advocated for a peaceful society after the end of apartheid in South Africa. More on that later on. Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, and originally from Ghana, also tried to apply the Ubuntu philosophy in his life. Among other things, to foster consensus and emphasize ethics in his approach to peace and international relations in complex situations in conflict zones, including in his attempts to prevent the conflict in Syria. A telling statement of him is, "We are not only all responsible for each other's safety, we are also, to a certain extent, responsible for each other's well-being. Global solidarity is both necessary and possible. It is necessary because without a certain degree of solidarity, no society can be truly stable and no one's prosperity is truly guaranteed." But also very recently, on February 6th, Ubuntu made the news at the start of the Winter Olympics. And although it is of course a competitive sporting event, the chair of the International Olympic Committee, Kirsty Conventry, referred in her opening speech to the spirit of Ubuntu from Africa, her home country is Zimbabwe, and explained its meaning. She said, "We can only move forward by helping others. Our strength comes from caring for one another. We are all connected. Our strength comes from how we treat each other. The best of humanity is to be found in courage, compassion, and kindness. South African philosopher Mogobe Ramose from the University of Pretoria has written a standard work on Ubuntu called Ubuntu, Stream of Existence as a Philosophy of Life. He says, Ubuntu is the root of African philosophy. Being an African in the universe cannot be separated from Ubuntu. Likewise, the African tree of knowledge originates from Ubuntu, with which it is inextricably linked. Ubuntu actually consists of two words, namely Ubu, meaning being in general as a unity, the all-encompassing, and Ntu, concrete manifestation of being in the material world. Ramose indicates that Ubuntu incorporates important ingredients of the ancient wisdom of Africa, but it is a somewhat more limited reflection of it. We will now compare Ubuntu with the universal ancient wisdom of Africa, and we do that by comparing them once again with the 6 basic principles of Theosophia as a reference. The first principle, the oneness of all life. At the left side on the table, you see again the ancient wisdom of Africa, and at the right side, the Ubuntu philosophy. The idea of oneness, of being part of a larger whole, such as nature and the human community, is very purely and clearly preserved in Ubuntu philosophy. We also find this in the expression, I am because we are, and in the Sotho language saying, moto ke moto kabato. A person is a person through other persons, meaning being human is affirming one's humanity by recognizing and respecting the humanity of others and establishing relationships with them on that basis. The second principle of Theosophia, the boundless potentials and evolutions of all beings. In various Bantu languages, the concept of Bato is important. It means mutual respect and compassion, caring for one another, giving each other space for development, caring for nature, and showing solidarity with one another are paramount. But we also find it reflected in the idea of hierarchy, that there are differences in development between people and that therefore the wisest must act as tribal leader, as chief. We also find this reflected in the Gotla gatherings, typical of Ubuntu, where the adults of the tribe gather under the leadership of the chief and exchange ideas on issues and policies. In this way, ideas are developed and decisions are made collectively, based on consensus. More on this later on. Then the third principle, the cyclical development. Ubuntu simultaneously denotes being and becoming, which also clearly reflects the concept of continuous cyclical movement. Everything is always in a state of development. This is something very characteristic of Ubuntu. Ramose also speaks of being as becoming, stating that it concerns cyclical processes connected by cause and effect. Regarding the concept of cyclicity, we should note that Ubuntu does not necessarily assume reincarnation. Ubuntu considers humans as composite beings, not in the form of spirit, soul and body, but solely in the form of soul and body. people speak of the immortality of the soul and not that of the spirit. Ubuntu has a tradition of ancestor worship. From a theosophical perspective, we believe this originated in the same way as in ancient China. Initially, the gods were revered as the source of the earliest humans and were therefore considered their ancestors, with humans being a reflection of them. But eventually, this degenerated into the veneration of recent generations as ordinary human ancestors. We will now explore the application of Ubuntu in society, including governance, politics, justice, and economics. This generates several interesting ideas from which we in the West can certainly learn something. How does Ubuntu take shape in governance? Tribal governance in the Godla remains important in African society. The Godla is used as a continuous platform for dialogue, open communication, and decision-making. Only adult members of a community who can all participate. The goal is to utilize the wisdom and talents of all present, that is, the collective intelligence. A key factor, and one that differs from the West, is the effort to reach decisions based on consensus, which also ensures support for the decision. The guiding principles of the Godlas clearly emphasize the idea of unity, the importance of the community, and the importance of openness, expressing everyone's opinion and ensuring there is no hidden agenda. In Botswana, the saying, "Dialogue is the best form of war," is typical, indicating that people are willing to go to great lengths to reach a solution. The principles of the Godla are as follows. Every adult has the right to attend the Godla. Every voice counts. There is trust in the dialogue. There is respect for others. Stories are a means of communicating a message. The truth is shared. There is observational listening, and a decision always follows. In the past, it was mainly men who participated. Today, more women are also taking their place in the Godla meetings. In the pure Ubuntu philosophy, the chief is held to high standards. In Botswana, for example, he is chief by the people and only with the people's consent. If he no longer adequately represents their interests, he can be disposed. What is expected of the chief is wisdom, the ability to listen well, ask the right question, and uncover the truth. Furthermore, he must lead the way in building a vision, be the unifying force, and ensure an atmosphere of trust and effective decision-making. Besides the chief, former tribal elders also have their specific role within the Godla as guardians of wisdom. If you compare Ubuntu a bit simplistically black and white with Western governments, you will see quite a few differences. For examples, in the West, you see parliamentary democracies where the common good becomes the subject of political tug-of-war because different parties have different interests. Within Ubuntu philosophy, this is much less the case. The Western parliamentary system with the majority rules can sometimes struggle, while with the Ubuntu philosophy, people keep talking until a problem is resolved based on consensus. Let's have a look at differences in focus between the Ubuntu approach and the Western approach. In Ubuntu, there is always a focus on common interest. In Western approach, we see a focus on individual or the own group interests. In Ubuntu, we see social aims and skills play a very important role. In Western approach, in a lot of cases, technical aims and skills are very important. In Ubuntu, we see everyone's right, who is an adult, to attend the Kotla. In Western situation, most of the time only invited guests may attend meetings. And finally, if we look at Ubuntu, there is a focus on trust, on dialogue, consultation, and decision-making based on genuine consensus. This is different in the Western approach. We see negotiation, persuasion in debates, power, and decision-making by majority vote. In fact, we see a contradiction between the Western ingenuity of self-thinking or group interest thinking and the ethical, social, and trust-building skills of Ubuntu. Ubuntu has played an important role in the decolonization of the African continent in recent decades. During colonial times, much of Africa was occupied by Western powers. There, Ubuntu philosophy has played the role of an often humanist-inflected philosophy of liberation. After all, it was a philosophy that incorporated wisdom from African culture. This allowed African peoples to break away from Western thought models of the colonial era, drawing on their own roots. In recent history, Ubuntu is also seen as the foundation for the emergence of the modern Republic of South Africa. It also sometimes referred to as an African Renaissance, the idea of making decisions by consensus, with a focus on the collective interest in ethics as its guiding principles. During his imprisonment on Robben Island, Nelson Mandela was inspired by Ubuntu, and from there he reflected on the future of South Africa. It gave him the courage to prioritize the collective interests of white and black people, and on that basis persuade the white minority government to abolish the apartheid system. Between his release in 1990 and the first non-racial elections in 1994, South Africa balanced on the brink of a bloody civil war for several years. By applying the reconciliation elements of Ubuntu, Mandela was able to avert this. This reconciliation strategy remains a source of inspiration for many in dealing with and containing major conflicts, even if they are not always able to utilize that inspiration. We will look at some more examples. Ubuntu also has some strikingly different emphasis in justice than we are used in the West. The central point, as far as it's written, is that it concerns the rights and freedoms of the community, not primarily the rights and freedoms of individuals. Moreover, it concerns concrete situations, not certain abstract legal principles, such as those we know in the West. The following story gives an example. Two village chiefs of a particular tribe had been embroiled in a dispute over a piece of land for over a year. This dispute was having a negative impact on the community, and a schism threatened. The chief of the tribe therefore convened a Gotla meeting. The dispute was discussed. At the end of the dialogue, the chief delivered his verdict. He delivered it in the form of a poem. The key of it was as follows. One is born for leadership and does not fight for it. Welcome to him who ends the fight. Separate your dogs, for they will tear each other to pieces before they see a plentiful meal waiting behind them. And this metaphor from the chief was enough to end the fighting. Furthermore, Ubuntu's focus is on the crime and not primarily on the criminal. Furthermore, African law is positive, meaning it focuses much more on thou shalt than thou shalt not, because it assumes that one should live as much as possible according to the rules of the community. The most important characteristic of Ubuntu-inspired justice is focus on restoring harmony, restoring a disturbed balance, and working towards reconciliation. From a theosophical perspective, this image certainly brings to mind karma, the universal law of cause and effect, which is also described as the law of restoring harmony or balance. In this system of Ubuntu, there is no statute of limitations on a crime. The idea is that a disturbed balance, even after 40 years, still needs to be restored. Restoring harmony, reconciliation, and reparation are central concepts in Ubuntu philosophy. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a prime example of this. We will now go to the third part of the lecture, Living by Ubuntu, and I will give a few practical examples. We will show examples of how Ubuntu is applied in practice, and you may judge for yourself to what extent these examples meet the truism of the English writer Carlyle, which were quoted by Blavatsky, which is as follows. The end of man is an action and not a thought, though it were the noblest. Let us have first a look at South Africa in the early 90s. When Nelson Mandela was received in 1990 and apartheid was abolished, there was a widespread call for justice for all victims of the apartheid regime. The idea for the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission did, however, create a dilemma. Some advocated for the prosecution of all criminals, while others advocated for amnesty for everyone, to start a new South Africa with a clean slate and new legislation. This all-or-nothing approach was considered a difficult choice, as prosecuting all perpetrators was an impossible task, and amnesty for all those people was also out of the question. The core idea was the people want to undergo a kind of mental cleansing process to bring the truth and injustice to light. Perpetrators had to be able to be held accountable, and victims had to be able to openly describe what had happened to them. This led to the formulation that people who had committed unacceptable acts during the apartheid regime would publicly disclose these acts and explain their role in the system, thus qualifying for amnesty. This was one aspect of the process, aimed at obtaining the most complete picture possible of human rights violations. On the other hand, victims were expected to tell the truth about what had actually happened, also to restore their dignity. Following this, in light of restoring harmony, compensation programs could then be discussed so these people could rebuild their lives. The goal was to process as many cases as possible, and the commission, chaired by Desmond Tutu, worked for years. While 22,000 applications were received from victims, only 2,000 were able to tell their story publicly. The first major conclusion of the 1998 report was the condemnation of apartheid as a crime against humanity. The second major conclusion, at least as important in light of restoring balance, was that the white people who had maintained the apartheid regime, as well as those in the ANC, African National Congress, who had used considerable violence, were guilty of violating human rights. The third conclusion was the Commission led a long and detailed process that significantly contributed to processing South Africa's collective trauma. It is still considered a success despite its difficulties. It played a key role in South Africa's more even transition from an apartheid-era country to a multiracial state, one of harmony, compensation, and reconciliation. The Commission's example has been welcomed elsewhere in the world, but its implementation has always proven to be quite a challenge. The next example is Rwanda. Instead of Ubuntu, Rwanda has the identical concept of Ubuntu, which means being human. This concept played a crucial role in pre-colonial Rwanda. It was based on the idea of the interconnectedness of people and their shared humanity. It emphasizes the importance of community, compassion, and solidarity, and is often expressed in the phrase, "I am because we are." The colonial powers introduced the idea of ethnic identity and divided the population into the main groups, the Twa, the Hutus, and the Tutsis. The division was used to justify colonial rule by portraying the Tutsis as a superior group entitled to privileges and power. The division created a new form of identity based on ethnicity rather than on the traditional social structures and principles of the Ubuntu philosophy. This division and the subsequent erosion of social cohesion and solidarity in Rwandan society contributed to the tragedy of 1994. Rwanda faced massive and brutal violence with an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus killed and 2 million people fleeing the country over a 3-month period. There was a pressing need for reconciliation to ease ethnic tensions within Rwandan society. I will mention 3 examples of measures that have been introduced to contribute to this process of reconciliation. First, reintroduction of traditional local Kachaka courts, also from a practical perspective. Rwanda's formal courts were struggling with a backlog of more than 120,000 prisoners living in deplorable conditions. Kachaka courts are a traditional Rwandan phenomenon where people sit on the grass to settle their disputes in the presence of community members presided over by persons of exemplary conduct. It is based on voluntary confessions and apologies from perpetrators. The focus is not on punishing perpetrators, but on achieving reconciliation. The second measure, the building of so-called reconciliation villages, where victims and perpetrators live side by side after completing a reconciliation process. Currently, approximately 300,000 people live in such new reconciliation villages out of a total population of 14 million. The third measure, Umuganda, coming together with a common goal to achieve a certain result. Traditionally, Rwandans called on their family, friends and neighbors to help them complete a difficult task. On the last Saturday of every month, all able citizens work together on activities such as planting of trees, building houses and cleaning of streets to promote growth and foster reconciliation. The next example is of Ghana, Kofi Annan's birthplace. There they know the concept of the Akan people called Sankofa. This concept implies that if you forget something valuable and go back to retrieve it, there is nothing wrong with that. Sankofa embodies humility, reflection, and respect for ancestors and teaches that progress comes from understanding and honoring history. It is symbolized, among other things, by a mythical bird depicted looking back and holding an egg in its beak, and symbolizes returning to something valuable, knowledge, heritage, or lessons. The bird's posture illustrates the balance between looking back and moving forward. The next example is from Botswana. Botswana is a country that has been praised for decades for truly applying the Ubuntu philosophy. The Economist in 2005, The Economist magazine named Botswana the best performing economy in Africa thanks to its adoption of Ubuntu. Grotla meetings are also used not only in the country's governance but also in businesses to leverage the collective brainpower of employees and gain involvement and support for company policies. At the national level, it has been a multi-party parliamentary republic since already 1966, and new political parties are currently also given the opportunity to contribute to governance. The country's various tribes, along with their chiefs, sit in a form of Senate. It is a stable democracy, free from large-scale violence and ethnic tensions. The poverty line has fallen from approximately 59 to 70% in 40 years' time. However, inequality remains a significant challenge, as does the growing youth and employment problem. The country's economic prosperity has become heavily dependent on the diamond sector. Therefore, initiatives are being developed to diversify the economy by, among other things, promoting tourism, agriculture, and education. Despite the major challenges, it remains a country that serves as an example on the African continent by applying Ubuntu philosophy. Then I have some international examples. Israel, with the example of the Parents' Circle. Hundreds of Palestinians and Israelis who lost a close family member in the violence have organized themselves in the Parents' Circle. They are the living proof that reconciliation is possible indeed. They support each other, teach, hold conferences, and produce films and brochures. They organize memorial days to share their humanity and honor their children. Then a recent example in France. The victims of the terrorist attack in France 10 years ago at the Bataclan are seeking healing and are committed to preventing recurrence. Many people, more than 130, were killed in this attack. Now, 10 years later, a growing number of victims are choosing to contact the perpetrators as part of restorative justice. The motive is often to meet the other person as a human being, to try to understand something. It appears that both sides, so the perpetrators and the family of the victims, are open to this. Finally, the last example, the elders. On his 89th birthday, July 18, 2007, Nelson Mandela brought together the elders to form independent moral voices for peace and ethical leadership. It is a World Council of prominent figures established to help resolve global problems and conflicts, characterized by Ubuntu. Wikipedia speaks of the idea of traditional village wisdom as a basis. Mandela's motto was, "It always seems impossible until it's done." In addition to Mandela and Tutu, this international group included former US President Jimmy Carter and UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Mandela's widow, Graça Machel, still remains vice chair. Former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos currently chairs the council. He received the Nobel Prize in 2025 for successfully ending his country's 50-year civil war. Since their founding, the elders have been particularly active in mediating conflicts and preventing escalation. Unfortunately, this has not always led to success, as was the case, for example, in their attempts to prevent the conflict in Syria. But they keep the idea of helping communities alive through the Ubuntu philosophy. I want to sum this lecture up. Ubuntu is an example of human ethics with its roots in the universal ancient wisdom of Africa. In this lecture, we compared the ancient wisdom of Africa, which originated in ancient Egypt, with the fundamental ideas of Theosophical, and showed that they are identical when you consider the three basic ideas on the boundlessness of life, the boundless potentials and evolution of all beings, and the cyclical unfoldment through cooperation with other beings. Next, we compared Ubuntu philosophy with the ancient wisdom of Africa, and we concluded that the Ubuntu philosophy reflects to a high degree the universal ancient wisdom of Africa. However, we must note that in its elaboration on what life entails, for example, cyclicity in the form of reincarnation and the composite nature of man, some ideas are missing or can no longer be called theosophical. But the idea of collectivity guided by the wisest and the importance of the community caring for one another, compassion, respect, and solidarity are clearly paramount. The Ubuntu philosophy is based on universal human ethics, and therefore there is no reason for pessimism about the African continent. Ubuntu, with its unique interpretation of, for instance, governance and justice, can certainly serve as an example for Western countries in the question of how we can grow into an ethical society in which everyone feels at home. This is the end of the lecture. We will now have a 3 minutes break, and after that we will have a short study of some 30 minutes. And if you want to join the study, please send an email to the following address: info@blavatskyhouse.org. See you in 3 minutes from now. Welcome back. Erwin, are there questions?
Not directly on via YouTube, so probably we can continue via Zoom for the study.
Okay. So we will move to the study part. I think it is now time to have a look at the next week series that is starting in our study. Next week starts a new series of 4 lectures in that is called Universal Wisdom in the Eastern Tradition. And the first lecture is called The Mystic East. It will start next week, Sunday. And then there will, I think, be a break during Easter. Yes, if I look at the dates, when it continues with the Buddha, the cyclic messenger, and so on. So you're most welcome to follow the lecture, but also to join the study next week. And now we are going to close the study by going to the Gayatri Mantra, which reads as follows. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.